Welcome back, everyone. It's round two recap of Battle of the Sexes from Gibraltar. In this game, I played Jovanka Houska. She's a well-known commentator, player, author, and she actually has a book on the Caro Kann. And I decided to play e4 this game and test her Caro Kann. And this is basically her main opening for black. It was the only thing I was really preparing for. And I decided to play a two knights attack, which maybe the super fans of this channel would know. I made a video a few months ago on how to crush the Caro Kann, in which I show a lot of different traps emerging from this line. Now, unbeknownst to me, I only found out this after the game, is that she actually watched that video and had some idea of landmines for white, and of course was prepared for this. I took and played knight to f6. And this is one of the main lines. And I played the most trendy move these days is queen to e2. And at first this move looks a little bit anti-positional because I do block the bishop, but the point is to align on the e-file and threaten to take and force black to take back with the g-pawn. There's also a nice trap here if knight b to d7, white is mating in one with knight d6. This would be a nice smother mate, but of course she did not fall into that. She took, I took, and now the main move here is queen to d5, just going for the queen trade, and I had some preparation here, but she played a sideline, queen to a5, which I was mildly prepared for. Like, I was aware of this move. I'll admit I didn't look at this move before the game, but I looked at this move like a few weeks ago when I was just doing general preparation. And the move I had in store to meet queen a5 is pawn to b4. So hitting the queen, getting some initiative. She played very quickly queen to f5, going for a queen trade. And here I played basically the last move of my preparation, queen to e3. And this is a gambit. I am giving away a pawn. Now, it's very risky for black to take it, because after queen c2, I would have bishop d3, queen a4, and I'd probably play bishop to b2 here, sacking yet another pawn. And if we entered this position, it would have been just a complete chaotic mess, given that white is down two pawns, but I'm pretty much complete with development, can play rook b1 in this position, and this would have been a really fun position to play. I'm a little bit disappointed we didn't get to play this out. It does have some resemblance to the Danish gambit, where white sacks two pawns for very open position, two bishops, more development. But she played a much safer move here, queen to e6, which is one of the strategies for black in a position like this, is to get queens off the board early and steer the game into more strategic and positional battle. So this was what I was, I guess I was expecting more, and I went ahead, played bishop to b2, and after takes, we reach a position. Queens are off the board early, but there's definitely some imbalances with the pawn structure. I have a slight lead in development, and here she played a very typical move for the position, even though maybe it would make Ben Feingold cringe, is pawn f6. Now, there are cases where you should sometimes play f6, and this is one of them. It's actually a very useful move for black to blunt the power of my dark squared bishop and prepare pawn e5, and then eventually activate black's dark squared bishop. So I had a small think here, deciding how to complete development, and decided to play the most natural bishop c4. She played pawn e5, attacking pawn on b4. I played a3. And now she played pawn a5, so probably the most confrontational move, forcing me to decide how to deal with the pawn tension. Of course, black is threatening to take. And at first I wanted to play b5, but I think this would just lose time for white. After takes, bishop d7, I'd be having to move this bishop a bunch of times. So instead, I decided to take. And after rook takes a5, we reach a position where I have all my minor pieces developed. Black has no minor pieces developed, just a rook developed. And I figured now is a good time to try and open up the position. And I went ahead and played pawn d4. which I thought is the most kind of thematic move, challenging the pawn chain, trying to make this bishop have some life. Now, this move gives black essentially two options. I have three attackers on e5, so black has to decide whether to take or play e4. And in the game, she played e4, which I think is a safer move. If black takes here, I would take back with the e-pawn, and then the e-file would be open. I'd be ready to castle, get a rook to e1, and start targeting the king. And black's king would maybe be a little bit difficult to find a safe place for it, given that it's hard to castle for black. So after e4, the position closed down a little bit, but I was happy to see this move because after knight d2, the e-pawn's a little bit overextended, and black doesn't necessarily want to play f5, even though it defends the pawn. It could allow for some potential g4 at some point, and black is still very much behind development. Not to mention, maybe someday I could go for like bishop e3, c4, and d5, unleash my dark square bishop. So she decided to play bishop to f5, defending the pawn, but this gives me a chance to castle and attack the bishop, get the rook to the half-open f-file. She plays bishop g6. And here, I really wanted to try and target the pawn right away with a move like rook f4, but this would allow bishop d6, and then my rook would be hit, and then eventually f5 would probably come. So I figured that I just want to improve, and one way to improve in this position is to play a4 to essentially prevent any prospect of black playing b5, but also get the pawn off a square where it was attacked twice. So essentially this move, it fights for a little bit of space on the queen side, and later on my plan is to play some move like bishop c3 or knight b3 and eventually get the pawn to a5 and get some positional bind on the queen side. Now the drawback of a4, it did allow bishop to b4, hitting my knight. And I thought for a bit because I could play knight b3, but I wanted to keep some pressure against e4 pawn, so I played pawn c3. Now at first this move looks just terrible given that my bishop is now stuck behind the pawn chain, but I do get tempo against black's bishop, and I thought long term eventually I will play c4 someday and expand on the queen side and make this bishop happy again. So she played bishop to e7. Now I will note if bishop d6, my plan was to play bishop to b3 to prepare knight c4, and the bishop would be a bit exploitable on d6. On top of that, I'd have ideas of bishop c2 to pressure the pawn. So bishop e7 I think was very reasonable. And here I play bishop to e6. So this move looks a little bit overambitious because I just go in deep into black's territory. The bishop's not supported by anything, but this was intended to be a prophylactic move. I was trying to tie down black as much as possible. With the bishop on e6, it's more difficult for black to play f5. If we look at f5 here, I would have knight c4, the rook would have to move away, and then I win the pawn. So f5 is not playable, and black can't easily castle, of course, and I'm ready to either play knight c4 or knight b3 or pawn c4. So I thought bishop e6 was a nice way of making progress in the position. And one more thing to note, if bishop to f7, I would have bishop f5, and this pawn would be a goner. So not easy to find a clear plan for black here, but she did develop her final minor piece with knight d7, and I play knight b3, hitting the rook a7, and now pawn to c4. So expanding on the queen side, this is a move I was hoping to play back when I played pawn c3. And when I played pawn c4, I was calculating a funny line. It was a very deep line, which we didn't go into, but I do want to show it because it featured some cool kind of board geometry. Because I thought one candidate move for black here would be knight to f8 to try and remove the bishop and force some trades. And against this move, I was going to play bishop to f5, offering the trade of bishops. After takes, the threat is rook f4 to win the pawn. So it looks very natural for black to play pawn g6 here to get in the eventual pawn chain, connect 4 pawn chain. And against this move, I'd spotted the really nice resource rook a5, essentially forcing a trade of rooks. And after takes, in the very end, I have a fork against the pawns, and white would be winning a pawn here. Now, after I played c4, I realized there's a move rook a6. But then it's still interesting because after takes, knight d2, f5, there's d5 hitting the rook and the pawn. So I was doing some very deep calculations here. This is one of the nice things about having a lot of time to think in a classical game and really delve into the position and be imaginative with various calculations. But she took a long think after I played c4, and rather than playing knight to f8, she played a move which I didn't even consider at all, is rook to f8, which has some logic to it. It does, in some cases, support f5. Other case, it allows for bishop f7, and then rook takes f7. So here I took another think and decided to just improve the position further, play pawn a5. I figured this would be a move I would play eventually. The pawn is well supported, and it fixes a pawn on b7. So she played bishop f7. We trade, takes. And here there's an interesting battle on the king side, given that the pawn is still a bit overextended, and there's a few different ways for me to attack it. And the move I initially wanted to play was rook f4, but after pawn f5, if I go for g4, there's bishop g5. And then e3 turns out to be quite vulnerable here. So instead of playing rook f4 immediately, I decided to play g4 first, preventing this whole idea of f5 and bishop g5. And I thought that was a bit clever, because now I prepare rook f4, and if I get one more move in, I am winning the pawn on e4. So black has to be precise here. She played what I think the best move is pawn h5. Maybe an alternative is g6 and then f5. But h5 was quite interesting because I didn't necessarily want to take and allow f5, and then I have less pressure against the pawn. So I decided to maintain the pawn on g4 with h3. We trade, takes, and now she plays g6. So preparing f5. And here I had a decision to make. There was a line that I wanted to go into, but it would have, I think, just simplified everything. The move I wanted to play was rook f4, hitting the pawn, but after pawn f5, takes, rook f1, I'm winning this pawn, but again, black has this resource bishop g5, and after takes, king g2, takes. This position, a lot of pawns have come off the board. Maybe white has some slight chances, but after a move like b6, I think there's going to be more trades, and this would be very likely to be a draw. And I thought I had a slight advantage, just given I have more space on the queen side, have some positional play on both the king side and the queen side. So instead of playing rook f4, I played rook to f2, which prevents the idea of bishop g5 to hit the rook. And the plan is still the same, is to double up and then eventually go after this pawn with a move, maybe to start with bishop c3 and then knight d2. So here she played pawn to b6. And it was a fascinating position because there's a strategic battle on both the king side and the queen side. And we kind of both had to juggle the different ideas on both sides of the board. And with b6, she's just trying to neutralize my queen side play, trade off my strong a5 pawn. And I didn't really want to take, because after rook takes a1, one of my pieces would have to go into the corner, and then the knight would come alive on b6 to target c4. So instead, I played bishop c3, reinforcing the pawn. She played bishop d8. And here I play knight d2, so going after e4 pawn, essentially forcing black to play f5. And now I play rook a to f1, so just abandoning a5 pawn and trying to win f5 pawn, because in the event that black takes on a5, I would take, and then e4 would be very weak, and I think white would have good chances to play for a win in this position. So instead, what happened is she played a very nifty move, bishop to h4, which forces my rook off the f-file. If I play rook f4, keeping the pressure, then bishop g3 just traps my rook. During the game, I was worried about bishop to g5, but bishop g3 is even stronger, and my rook would be gone. So I had anticipated bishop h4 and saw the idea to play rook h2. Bishop moves back to g5, so now e3 is hanging. It's kind of awkward to defend, but I was banking on the idea rook to h8. And what this move does is forces black to make some concession to get out of check. Black has 3 legal moves here, rook f8, knight f8, and king e7. And here she thought for at least 5 minutes, deciding what move to play. Eventually decided on king e7. I will note if knight f8, that leaves a pawn undefended, and I'd be able to take. Maybe it's still playable for black because there is bishop e3 with check. But I would have been fine there. And if rook f8, I would take, and then f5 would hang. And I thought in these lines I would have good chances to still play for a win. So king e7 was definitely the most challenging move. And I spent a long time here trying to just figure out what's going on, because position can get very, very messy very quickly. I essentially had 2 candidate moves between bishop b4 and pawn takes b6. And I really wanted to play bishop to b4 check, which almost wins by force. Point being, if king e6, and then there's rook to e8 check. And then the king is almost in a mating net. If king f6, there is my beloved pork, the pin, plus the fork, and white would be winning the bishop after king g7, knight g5. And then there's a funny line, if bishop e7, bishop is pinned from behind, the king is very vulnerable, and my calculation was d5 check. After takes, in one way or another, the king will be driven away from defending the bishop. If takes, then I win the bishop. And if king f6, again, there's knight takes e4, but I was calculating g5. And again, the bishop will eventually be lost. So I was optimistic about this move, but black has a resource pawn c5. And then there's a really complicated line, which I think I'll have to analyze further with the engine, because it could have gotten really messy after takes. And in between move attacking the rook, black would take here, king h1. And now the rook can move to b7. And after takes, it looks good for white, given that I have 3 pawns ready to march down the board, bishop aligned with the king. But after bishop takes c5, it appears as if black is completely fine, and I thought these pawns could maybe be a hassle to deal with. Now the engine just gives equality in this position, so I guess Stockfish knows best. But I decided not to go for that, and instead played pawn takes b6, which in some sense is a pawn sacrifice, because I lose e3, black delivers check, played king h1, and now knight takes b6. And I'm down a pawn here, and for some reason during the game I didn't realize I was down a pawn, given that e3 would just fall off the board, and I'm not winning the pawn back so cleanly. So the move I played here was a bit fancy, is knight takes e4. And I was banking on tactics working for me, because black can't take back. If pawn takes e4, I takes, and then skewer and win the rook on a7 in the end. Unfortunately, after knight takes e4, I'm still under a lot of pressure. And she could have played knight takes e4 immediately and still be up a pawn, and then it's up to me to equalize. But she played the move rook to a4, so keeping a lot of pressure, threatening the pawn again. And now my knight is actually hanging, because I don't have the same tactic of rook f7 and rook h7. So I was getting really low on time at this point. We're on move 35. On move 40, we get an extra half hour, but I had just a couple minutes to make my next 5 moves. And I As you'll see, I kind of freaked out and did not handle the position as best as possible. I started with pawn takes f5. This is completely fine. G takes f5. And then I played rook to e1, hitting the bishop. Unfortunately, she's able to leave the bishop on e3 and take on c4 and yeah, just go up a pawn. And now my knight is still attacked. I played knight to c5 and she played rook to a2. So this is move 38. I have two more moves to go until I get more time. And it was a very difficult position to try and navigate with almost no time on the clock. I played the move rook to b1, which I thought was useful to go for counterplay against black's king. Engine is giving one move to maintain equality, rook h6, which I didn't even consider. Idea is a bishop is pinned to the king, so there's no bishop h6, and there's a cool threat of rook takes e3 and rook e6. So maybe if I had more time, I would have found this move. But after rook to b1, she played rook c2, and this is where I just kind of freaked out. I let my time tick all the way down to 2 seconds. And then I had flashbacks of the first round game where I flagged, right? I thought I made my move quick enough, but I didn't. So I saw my time was at 2 seconds, and I very quickly blitzed out bishop a1, which is a really sad move to play, putting my bishop in the corner. My bishop's blocked by the d-pawn. But it was an attempt to just stay alive. And at this point, I knew I was just trying to hold on for dear life. She played the move knight d6, and we finally reach move 40. I have 30 more minutes to try and deal with this position. I was not happy with how the last several moves unfolded. I'm now down a pawn. My king is just cornered. My bishop is terrible. This pawn is weak. Black has a pass f pawn. I was feeling very, very pessimistic. And then I had a cool idea. I had an idea. If I just sacrifice my rook, my bishop, my pawn, my knight, my other rook, it would be stalemate. So there's a funny line, pawn d5. Oh no, my pawn. Oh no, my rook. Oh no, my knight. Oh no, my bishop. Check. And oh no, my other rook. And it would be stalemate. Unfortunately, none of this is forcing. Black would have like multiple opportunities to mate me in that line I just showed. But the funny line did cross my mind. Unfortunately, yeah, it's not too realistic. And the move I played here to try and just hold on is rook to h2. And for those that analyze the game with Engine, Stockfish gave this as a terrible, terrible blunder. It turned out there is only one move to be slightly worse for white, is knight d3. I didn't play this move because I was scared of black going in for mating ideas with knight e4. Apparently white has enough counterplay with rook b7, but yeah, it was a terrifying position, and I played rook h2 with idea just to try and trade rooks and hold the position down a pawn. The problem is after rook takes h2, king takes h2, pawn f4, black is just rolling down the board. Pawn f3 is now a major idea. My pieces are still not the best placed. My king is out of play. And this is the position we reached. I realize I'm probably going to lose this game, but I thought might as well try and fight as much as I can. Decided to play knight to d3. She plays king e6, which is aiming to bring the king well into the position. Very typical in the endgame. You want to use the king as an active piece. I played king to g2, trying to get a blockade on f3. And after king to f5, I played king f3, and now rook to g7, threatening to play rook g3. And here I really wanted to play rook b6, which attempts to win the pawn. And if I can win this pawn and then sack my knight for the other pawn, I thought maybe there's some chances to survive in a pawnless endgame where I have rook and bishop versus rook, knight and bishop. The problem with rook b6 is black has a cool forcing line, rook g3, forcing king e2, rook g2, and my intention would have been to go back to f3. If I move to the first rank, there's rook g1 to pick up the bishop. But after king f3, there's rook to d2. And all of a sudden, I don't have a great way to hold on, given that if I move my knight, let's say knight e5, then rook f2 is mate. And there's a few interesting lines here, which I was calculating. If I take on c6, black can take on d3, and then if I take the knight, there's bishop takes d4 with discover check. And when I first saw this, I was actually hopeful that even though it looks like I'm losing a bishop, there's a pin. The problem is I only have 2 legal moves, and after either move, let's say king e2, the rook will deliver a check, and then black will win the bishop and win the game. Same thing with king g2, rook g3 check. So I was sad when I saw this because it's really, really close to white's holding on. Another line I wanted to play was knight takes f4 here, but then after bishop takes f4, rook takes c6, it looks like I'm getting what I want, an endgame where maybe I can survive with rook bishop against rook knight and bishop. The problem is after knight e4, I'm just in a mating net. There's actually no good way to stop knight g5, and there's no good checks against the black king, rook c5, there's knight takes e5. So going all the way back to this position, I wanted to play rook b6, but given the lines I just showed, it didn't seem like any of that worked for me. So I decided to play rook to b8, an attempt to get counterplay along the back rank. She continued here with rook to g3, forcing king e2, and this is where she finally showed some mercy. Black is still better here after a move like rook g2, king f3, and then rook g1, and I'd still be just hanging on by a thread. But instead she played the move knight to c4, which just allowed me exactly what I want, is checks along the back rank. And this move is hard to explain. I'm not entirely sure what she overlooked, but I will say it was a very difficult battle up until this point, and sometimes in the later stages of the game, it can be easier to make oversights. And after rook f8, it's very difficult for black to escape the checks. In the game, she played king g5. I keep checking. King h4, rook h8, king g4, rook g8. And it's possible she overlooked that after king h3, rook h8, black cannot play king g2, because after knight e1, the king is getting almost mated here. King g1, only legal move. And then after knight f3, if king g2, I have rook h2 mate. So black would need to sack the exchange. And there's no way I'm losing this. If anything, white's playing for a win here. So I was very fortunate that the king can't go in deep. And instead of going in all the way, she played king g4. And I should also mention she was getting very low on the clock, fell below a minute, looking for some way to keep the game going, but I continued checking, and eventually we repeated 3 times, and the game ended in a draw. So it was a very intense battle. I was very fortunate not to lose this game, given that in the endgame I was dead lost, at least according to the engine, at a few different points. But it was a very interesting game. I felt good with overall opening preparation. At some point, maybe I could have maximized my chances to play for a win. But yeah, this pretty much wraps up round 2. It's been some fun games so far. I will say I was super exhausted after the game, had no energy to do the recap last night. So thankfully, I'm feeling more energized this morning. And I should probably get going because the next round starts in about 5 hours from the time of this recording. So today I'll be playing Nino Batsiashvili, who is a very solid player, very strong player. I have the black pieces, so stay tuned. As always, I'll leave links below in the video description to all the tournament information, live broadcast, elite chess broadcast, results and pairings. So I encourage people to follow live. And if you have any questions, leave them below, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.